ready.
If you're my age, or a little older, or a little younger, you may have a memory of looking at camera film negatives. Almost all of us take digital photographs with our portable telephones these days. But when I was a child, my mom and dad, and sometimes me, would snap pictures on rolls of film with the family camera, and then take that completed film to a nearby Target and drop it off to get that film developed into pictures. 3 or 4 days later, you would go back to Target or whoever processed the camera film and find 30 or so color photos in an envelope with your last name on it. Inside that same envelope, usually in a little paper pocket at the bottom, were cut strips of the original film in the form of photo negatives on brown or transparent plastic. I'm not going to explain the process of developing photographs because I don't know how that works with color photography. But the world inside those plastic strips of film negatives fascinated me when I was a child. Every time on the car ride home from Target, I would press the negative image strips against the window of my mom's car and find a bizarro world of familiar faces and places. The negatives literally inverted the colors of the normal photographs, the photopositives. Tree leaves were lavender, the sky appeared to be burnt orange, and grass that used to be green was now rendered an icy shade of blue. Photo negatives were a fixture of fascination through most of my childhood, and I looked through them almost as often as I flipped through the family picture albums. Imagining the negative world was another way to escape the tedium of reality and the boredom of routine. And that brings me to the first time I came across a Space Harrier cabinet in an arcade. Its very first level, Moot, was where I saw a photo negative operating in the color spectrum of my reality. The grass was an ethereal shade of checkerboard green and the sky was purple, and this tiny motherfucker in a red jacket and blue jeans was flying all over the screen, soaring through the clouds and blowing up spaceships with a laser cannon. And all of it was moving incredibly fast. Space Harrier is a chaotic barrage of color and violence that probably introduced 6-year-old me to the entire concept of psychedelia. My cartoons around then were too neutral and controlled. My picture books never went any further than talking animals. And Super Mario Bros. And other 8-bit Nintendo games, while conceptually wild, had limited color palettes and graphical capabilities. Space Harrier was a sensory assault on a level I had never experienced, a playable photo negative in a fantasy world. And all of it could be under my control for the low asking price of 25 cents. Space Harrier came to North American arcades in the December of 1985. I can't even remember where this arcade was, just that it existed. It was probably at the mall, a place my mom and grandmother dragged me to with alarming frequency. But every time I try to remember that mall's arcade, I find my memories are overwritten with the mall arcade John Connor and Budnick go to at the beginning of Terminator 2. Some research tells me there were 3 distinct models of that Space Harrier arcade cabinet. The first was a walk-up standing version, like a regular arcade cabinet. The second was a sit-down model, which always felt like a deluxe cabinet to me, a game you could play while sitting down. The third was the ultimate shit, the rolling cabinet, which was the sit-down model, but the goddamn chair moved left and right in response to the direction the player tilted the throttle. Space Harrier's rolling cabinet wasn't as elaborate or ornate as the motion-simulating cabinet Sega built a few years later for Afterburner, the same one John Connor played at that arcade in T2. But it was still something, man. For a 6-year-old, that experience, that range of motion responding to my own agency, was light years ahead of the shitty quarter-horse ride at the grocery store. And Space Harrier moves so fast. It was developed for Sega's Superscaler hardware, an escalating model of arcade boards that could fake 3D space by scaling, rotating, and accelerating sprites and sprite planes at ridiculous speed. Sega kicked off this technology with the Buck Rogers game in 1982, but the arcade hardware for Space Harrier actually debuted earlier in 1985 with Hang On. I'll probably talk more about Superscaler hardware on the inevitable Outrun episode, but just go look at Afterburner, Hang On, Outrun, Galaxy Force 2, and Power Drift. Any of those games, and picture how fast these things were moving in the mid and late 80s, back when home consoles were still clawing their way out of single-screen experiences. Plainly speaking, Space Harrier is an early example of a rail shooter. You pilot a guy, his name is Harrier, across the X and Y axis of the screen while simultaneously dodging projectiles and obstacles, all the while slamming the fire button to shoot enemies. One hit and you're dead, and lives are limited. Space Harrier has 18 total stages, and the game can be completed in under 20 minutes. It's very rudimentary, especially when compared to later rail shooters like Omega Boost or Star Fox 64. But by 1985, most games were still in a nascent phase of existence. Games were still fairly simple. Space Harrier's 18 levels also imagined a world beyond the screen. Tilt the flight throttle left or right, and rather than find Harrier bumping against the edges of the screen, the world scrolls with the character, complete with the background horizon parallaxing in the distance to reflect that change in space. You're in a world, and it doesn't necessarily matter which direction you're heading, just that you're rushing somewhere as quickly as possible. Another enjoyable facet of Harrier's traversal is how his character sprite changes when you bottom out and hit the ground. He doesn't crash, and he doesn't keep the same flying sprite. He transitions to a run animation. It doesn't matter that a human being can't actually run that fast, because guess what? Harrier's also been flying without a jetpack this entire time. Shit like this just happens in Dragonland, the world where this game takes place, and it doesn't matter why. Space Harrier, like most arcade games, has an attract mode that would flow through a few levels. But it was tough for me to ignore the friendliness and approachability of its title screen. A golden Space Harrier title card flips from the background to the foreground. On the left side, it's flanked by a cycloptic woolly mammoth and 3 green trees. The right side features our red-jacketed hero, Harrier, waving hello as he sits on the shoulder of a large 3-eyed green and silver robot. It's quaint by today's standards, but I remember the frame of mind that screen provided me when I was 6 years old. I understood the appeal of Space Harrier's action and the promise of controlling destruction. But I also liked the idea of a friendly teenager waving hello and inviting me to press start and become him. Teenagers were, and still are, frightening, but here was a nice one. Put a quarter in, hit the only button on the flight stick, and get that chime. Then you hear the voice.
Welcome to the fantasy zone. Get ready.
And yes, while Space Harrier takes place in something called Dragonland, it is set in the same world as Sega's cute-em-up original, Fantasy Zone. I've already talked about how Space Harrier's first level, Moot, looks, but I haven't said anything about how it plays. On the surface, it kinda looks like Star Fox or Panzer Dragoon or any other rail shooter. In practice, Space Harrier is a bit different, and not just because it was made years before either of those games. Its signature means of control is a flight stick throttle. This input mechanism grants the player analog control across the X and Y axis. Harrier moves across the screen at different speeds based on the player's tilt of that flight stick. Analog control felt like an innovation in that time, and a major reason why Space Harrier's early ports to the Master System, TurboGrafx, and Famicom didn't feel quite right with digital input through a D-pad. Speaking of feel, it also may not be apparent that Harrier, when left in neutral, will reset to the center of the screen. This action looks and feels weird now to play a game that does that, but again, this is when developers were just out here inventing shit for new games. There weren't many institutional standards. Resetting to the center of the screen must have felt right to Yu Suzuki and Space Harrier's staff of 5 developers. Giza is Space Harrier's second level, and it continues the journey through the photo negative. Its sandy checkerboard desert surface is complemented by a teal and pink gradient across the sky. Monstrous plants are initially fixed to the horizon, but turn Harrier more than 180 degrees to see cerulean World of Tomorrow skyscrapers, monoliths, and pyramids. Moot's trees and bushes, its lush vegetation, is replaced by Giza's dead trees and massive stone heads. Shifting biomes so quickly rarely makes sense in any game, but it is cool that every level is a little bit different. Stage 3, Amar, turns the ground silver and installs the industrial wastes of purple pipe systems. Amar is also where Space Harrier debuts Gadami, a floating, multi-segment snake creature with a head at both of its ends. This large, boss-class enemy is a trick Space Harrier often plays, leveraging tile scaling through conjoined segments that further sell the illusion of 3D space. It also breathes fireballs and can take up the whole fucking screen as its sky slithers in and out of the background. To me, it's a motion effect that still feels impressive today. Cecile, the 4th stage, is where Space Harrier starts to get cute, both literally and figuratively. The sky opens with pastel lines of blue, green, and red, but then a ceiling identical to the pink and silver floor falls overhead. This twin scrolling effect makes Space Harrier feel even faster, and the shift in enemies, composed of geometric tears called Binzabin, adds a literal other dimension to your opposition. The floor and ceiling shift in colors before giving way to a boss fight against some DOMs, which are hopping mechs. DOMs are inspired by some model of Gundam, but I wouldn't know which one because I refuse to reference anime in this episode. Maybe we'll ask Chris about it later.
We won't.
Speaking of direct and uncredited inspiration, the 5th stage is a bonus stage that inverts the rules of the game. You mount Falcor from the Neverending Story, or a crude approximation of Falcor called Uriah, and ram him into ground-based obstacles to score points. I bet Space Harrier's design team felt really clever here when they forced the player to do the opposite of what they had spent the whole game teaching them. Anyway, when Yu Suzuki redesigned Space Harrier's original planning documents, he not only cited Neverending Story as a direct influence, but also a 1982 anime series called Space Cobra, which was based on Roger Dean's art. Dean, if you're unfamiliar, is often thought of as the master of exotic fantasy landscapes for book and album covers in the 60s and 70s. Space Harrier clearly lifted it, and it fits right in with his aesthetic. Stage 6, Ulysses, is where Space Harrier takes a goth metal turn. In the background, a floating frozen city rises from the horizon. It's positioned atop a slab of land pulled from the earth, and it's just hovering there. Trees on the ground are replaced by strange techno-monoliths, and fuck it, why not, let's make the sky a purple to white gradient. Pacomen, flappy wing aircraft, are joined by Valkyries, bulbous twin-seater fantasy jets to form the enemy opposition. As opposed to the organic creatures of myth and legend from the first two levels, Ulysses is where it feels like Harrier is invading or fighting back against some kind of evil machine empire.
You're doing great.
Lucasia is the 7th stage. It brings back the pastel laser sky from Cecile, but it changes the surface to an aqua-teal checkerboard and plops a bunch of frozen mountains across the horizon. That's right, we're now in an ice level. Lucasia, inside of its frozen tundra, is also where the Cyclops woolly mammoth appears for the first time in-game. My guy doesn't really attack, he just kind of stands there and becomes an obstacle, just like all the ice rocks. Lucasia ends with a boss fight against Tetris, which is Tetris with an A instead of an I. Tetris is a collection of 8 armored triangles moving in 2 groups of 4. They're vulnerable, suffering a one-hit death when they open to fire projectiles. Stage 8 is called Ida, presumably named after the original Space Harrier designer at Sega, who remains uncredited other than Yu Suzuki citing him as the author of the original design document. Of course, Ida is also the name of the stone-faced head enemies, so maybe this is where they live. Anyway, Ida is another desert level with a blue city skyline on the horizon. But this time it's joined by some sand dunes and a green-gray sky. It ends in a boss fight against Shura, an even bigger floating face with a bunch of rocks that swirl around it like a Mega Man boss. Blow up those rocks, and then blow up Shura. Watch out for fireballs. Revi, maybe Revi, is the next level. The floor turns to a 3-color pink-silver-gray checkerboard. The sky becomes a silver gradient, and some kind of techno-Aztec situation appears as a city on the horizon. But then, the sky becomes another ground layer, and we're moving through another space tube. You know what other game did the ceiling floor double-scrolling trick pretty well? HAL Laboratories' Hyperzone for the Super Nintendo. Anyway, geometric cubes of different metallic colors then assault the player before giving way to a massive Dom Gundam boss thing at the end. Stage 10, Minia, seems like a place where I would like to have a nice Easter lunch, the only time of the year you're legally allowed to eat ham. It's a green surface with a pink-green sky. The major obstacle is a giant psychedelic mushroom straight out of a Peter Max painting. A bunch of jets are there too, but it's hard not to focus on the giant neon fungus. Minia ends in a fight against Tomos, which is just a bunch of orbs. I don't know if orb things were just easy to design in 1985 or if they were cool, but I think they're cool. Like any other normal person, I desire to have an expensive orb that I can hold while I ponder complex problems with no clear solution. Stage 8 is called Parms, like Parmesan without the extra syllables. Maybe it's called Darms. It's hard to differentiate P's and D's in the Space Harrier font. The floor here is a checkerboard shade of green while the background is composed of sandy brown plateaus. The world of the negative image is in full effect in Parms, as the brown color of plastic film somehow made greens stick out especially well. It feels like half the level is a boss fight against Salpedon, which is the same general thing as the double-headed Chinese dragon Gadami from the 3rd stage, except now it's dead, zombified. It's a bone dragon equivalent. Stage 12 is another bonus stage where you ride your luck dragon Uriah. It's the same as the previous bonus stage, Stage 5, except now you're blazing directly into machines instead of monsters. Drail is Stage 13. The purple sky and silver-pink ground return, but are joined this time by a city that reminds me of the bad future from Chrono Trigger. Mostly because there is an ominous dome tucked into the skyline. The remaining buildings also have red, yellow, and blue markings across them, which reminds me of socks I had in the 80s. Just huge white tube socks with red, yellow, and blue stripes. You don't really see that specific color combination on anything anymore. It was actually made illegal after 1989. Look it up. Anyway, Drail ends in a fight against Octopus, which looks nothing like an actual octopus, but is a cluster of 8 blue airships. Stage 14 is called Asute. The pastel sky and silver floor return along with some silver sand dunes off in the distance. For a moment, anyway. The ceiling falls over the top half of the screen and makes everything dark, like to the point where I can barely see what's going on. From there, it's an all-out assault on Binzabins and Makuden ships until the ceiling is lifted and the boss, Barbarian, appears. Barbarian is a weird guy skullface head surrounded by rotating pink jellyfish, or mushrooms, I don't know, I can't really tell. Viscel is the next stage, silver and green sky, brown and silver ground, on an otherwise unremarkable tree line with some mountains. Viscel is kind of a boring setting, but it does finally present Harrier, with his shining red jacket, with a chance to stand out from the rest of his environment. Varda, another creepy crawly bone dragon, is the boss. Natura is stage 17, and finally it's where we see one of the blue skies that would go on to define Sega's output in the 90s. The ground is a dismal shade of silver, but it presents a nice contrast to that screen-dominating blue sky. The green tree line suggests we're back in the wilderness, but the abundance of DOMs, the Gundam robots, suggests we're still in the technosphere. Natura ends in a fight against Stanley, which would seem like the name of a guy, but is actually a giant alien mothership that positions itself at the top of the screen. You can't actually hurt Stanley, just like every Stanley in real life, but you do have to stick it out and survive all the DOMs it drops out of Stanley's rear hatch. The penultimate level is called Narc. It's spelled N-A-R-K rather than the N-A-R-C slur used to suggest one of your buddies is obviously a police informant. Anyway, Narc is where Space Harrier goes completely out of its mind with light and color. The sky turns into a drifting gradient of teal, and the monochromatic city on the horizon is a coral color. We are living under the sea, or in Chrono Cross, or anywhere with an exaggerated 90s beach theme except from 1985. Challenge-wise, Narc and its barrage of DOMs and obstacles is fairly intense. The boss of Narc is called Wee Wee Jumbo, which, okay, and he's a flowing blonde-haired caveman-looking Poseidon-ass motherfucker complemented on each side by two magic cats. It's tough to tell what's going on here, but both cats appear to be blowing a purple force field around Wee Wee Jumbo. His whole deal looks like he was borrowed from Golden Axe had Golden Axe not needed another 4 years to be invented. Abyssumble is the final stage, and it's a pastel striped sky boss rush. Gadari, Barbarian, Squilla, Ida, Sepeldion, Sierra, and Valda all make an appearance. When you win, Uriah the Luck Dragon comes in, scoops Harrier up, and they ride off into the horizon together. The end fills the screen in gnarly orange font just before the high score roll pops up. Be sure to put in your initials. For the longest time, Space Harrier was a photo-negative fantasy zone exclusive to an arcade experience. I had access to a Master System at my grandparents' house, but the only games we had for that were the 7 that came with it when my mother picked it up at a yard sale. I finally got a Sega Genesis in the spring of 1994, and I rented Space Harrier 2, but that didn't really do it for me. Space Harrier 2 didn't sound right, it didn't look right, and it sure as shit didn't move right. As the 90s stretched on, so did the machines stacked in all of the arcades. The fighting game boom happened, Neo Geo games seemed to be everywhere, and most of the older cabinets from the 80s vanished. The one arcade I could ride my bike to, Tech World, never even had a Space Harrier cabinet, it was just gone. Space Harrier became a fleeting memory of a game I could barely recall. And I could only confirm it was real when it was referenced in GamePro or EGM. It basically stopped existing, discarded like it was part of the seasonal toy cycle. That lack of access in a world before the internet and on-demand video capture was truly a wild time. Retired arcade games existed only in our memories, almost as folktales kids told each other at recess. The afternoon in 4th grade where my friend AJ told me about Sinistar was the same afternoon I told him about Space Harrier, with all the hyperbole and bombast one could expect of two 9-year-olds trying to describe games they barely remember. That's how legends form on a very specific local level inside of a kid's brain. To me, Space Harrier was the shit, and it was always going to be the shit. I had to make people care about it, even if they thought I was just making it all up. I finally got to confirm that belief a few years later at the start of summer 1996. The Sega 32X, the 32-bit add-on hardware for the Sega Genesis, was left for dead and steeply discounted at all retailers. I was able to pick one up, bundled with Virtua Fighter for $20 goddamn at Toys R Us. At that time, it was clear the 32X was a commercial and critical failure, but even at such a young age, I was fascinated with video game technology. Even if it had been rejected by the market, that actually made it more interesting to me because at the $40 a week I was raking in from cutting grass, a lot of weird 32X games were now accessible to me. I didn't care if it was fun or even good, I just wanted to see what that thing could do to my Sega Genesis. At Toys R Us, huge bins of 32X games were $5 or $10, and over the course of a few trips that fall, I wound up with Knuckles Chaotix, Cosmic Carnage, Doom, Star Wars Arcade, Machine Head, Shadow Squadron, Brutal, Paws of Fury, Virtua Racing Deluxe, Tempo, and true arcade ports of Afterburner and Space Harrier. That Space Harrier 32X port is actually a pretty decent conversion of the game. The resolution and frame rate of the arcade original aren't really there, but it's good enough. And it even nails the sprite scaling and rotation that seemed impossible to properly pull off on a regular-ass Genesis game. Space Harrier sounded like it should, and best of all, those poppy pastel colors, the checkerboard floors, and the dreamy sky gradients were left in place. The negative world was no longer exclusive to fading memories of the arcade or to the window in my mom's Honda Accord. Now it was available to my 19-inch color television, the same one that eventually found its way into Chris's basement decades later. I remember playing that 32X copy of Space Harrier second, after I played Chaotix, and feeling like I had fulfilled a dream. Here, finally, was the game I swore existed and had no way to play or even look at for half a decade. At last, I could play Space Harrier whenever I wanted for however long I wanted. And yeah, like most direct home ports of arcade games, that fun only lasted about 15 or 20 minutes. But it was a fun 20 minutes every other day, then every other week, then every couple of years. But Space Harrier always found its way back into my rotation. By the time the Sega Saturn came out, Sega had started reissuing some of their arcade classic titles under the Sega Ages sub-brand. Ages is, of course, Sega spelled backwards. It was all very clever. Anyway, while the Sega Ages games were individual releases in Japan, Working Designs bundled Outrun, Afterburner, and Space Harrier and sold it as a collection in the United States. That collection is now one of the rarest Saturn games. I never got that, but I did import the standalone Japanese copy of Space Harrier for the Saturn in the early 2000s, which I could play at my leisure with my region-disabling action replay cartridge. The Saturn release of Space Harrier was even more arcade perfect than the 32X version. I played it here and there and I was glad to have it, but it didn't take long for me to lose touch with Space Harrier. Coincidentally, 2001 was also the year I got my first digital camera. My window to the negative world disappeared as digital cameras took over for analog film. I lost a reason and a reminder to check in with Space Harrier, and it sat on a shelf not far from my old Pentax camera. When the Sega Ages remake of Space Harrier came to a collection on the PlayStation 2, complete with its cheap-looking polygons and weird lock-on system, I barely noticed. I've still never played or even seen the pseudo-sequel, Planet Harriers. I wouldn't really think about Space Harrier again until early 2017, when Kazuma Kiryu traveled back to the 80s and walked into a Club Sega in Yakuza 0. Joining Fantasy Zone, Outrun, and Super Hang-On, a Space Harrier cabinet was at the in-game arcade and could be played, in its entirety, for 100 yen of the in-game currency. And suddenly I remembered, oh yeah, I love Space Harrier. And I got to continue that love affair for the next few years, as Space Harrier also wound up at Club Sega arcades in Yakuza 6, Judgment, Yakuza Like a Dragon, and Lost Judgment. I love Yakuza games, obviously, but sometimes I thought of them as $60 interactive menus to get to Space Harrier and Outrun. Playing Space Harrier as Kazuma Kiryu, or Goro Majima, or Takayuki Yagami renewed my interest in classic Sega Superscalar arcade games. Enough to where I bought those 3D editions of Space Harrier, Power Drift, and Outrun off the 3DS eShop. It also, in a careful negotiation with my wife, inspired me to pay the most amount of dollars I've ever paid for video game artwork, when I bought artist Killian Ing's original 36x24 Space Harrier print from Cook and Becker and hang it front and center above the basement fireplace. It's a tight poster, look it up. In the 6 years since Yakuza 0, I've really come to appreciate what Space Harrier is and what Space Harrier meant to me when I was 5 years old. The Dreamcast and Saturn versions, the former buried on a disc that came with a book about Yu Suzuki, and yes, I know, Space Harrier was available in Shenmue, but come on. Anyway, the point is, once film cameras left my active memory, so did Space Harrier. I have to believe these two events, as closely linked as they were in my past, were related. At this point, there are, of course, hundreds of games I have assigned meaning to over the course of 40 years. And I'm sure if I tried hard enough, I could tie anecdotal significance to most of those games. Did my mother's driving make me extra interested in Twisted Metal 2? Did my friends going to raves in their early 20s filter down to make me have an out-of-body experience with Rez? Do I like Kentucky Route Zero more because it's set in Kentucky? I don't know. I do know that I still have my old Pentax film camera. I got it when I was 17 for a black and white photography class in high school. And the camera currently sits below the living room television on a display piece, right next to two transformers that only look like cameras. It's a very appealing, brainy living room decoration. I get lots of compliments on it. Just kidding, no one has ever noticed any of that shit is there. I also know that there is still technically more Space Harrier somewhere on my horizon. In October of 2022, Sega released the Genesis Mini 2. It was another one of those mini consoles loaded with a curated selection of that console's library. This one was in the shape of the revised Genesis, the Model 2 that replaced the original. The heralded development studio M2 once again handled the port work, and for round 2 of the Genesis Mini, they included weirder game selections like Thunder Force 4, The Ooze, and Alien Fucking Soldier. On the Genesis Mini 2, the wizards at M2 also fixed the original release of Space Harrier 2 for its inclusion in the little console's library. They redid the sprite scaling and raised the frame rate to an acceptable level. Space Harrier 2 now looks and plays like more Space Harrier rather than this strange curio thrown out to boost the Genesis launch library. It's an old game made new and constructed with care to better resemble the original work. M2 also went and made a Genesis version of the original Space Harrier using the same tech. And minus some flicker, it looks really good. I was going to get that Genesis Mini 2 anyway, but when I read that, it became a little console I needed to have. A year later, and I still have not played M2's port of the improved Space Harrier 2. I actually haven't even plugged in the Genesis Mini 2. Instead, it sits below a different TV in my basement right next to the TurboGrafx Mini that I got and have also never plugged in. If you listened to our Crimson Dragon episode that concluded the Panzer Dragoon miniseries, I went into detail about how I squirrel away things that I know I'll like for an undefined time in the future, when I may or may not need it the most. Subconsciously, I may have already been doing this with Space Harrier. We have 2 televisions in our house, one upstairs in the living room and one downstairs in the video game dungeon. Both televisions sit above windows to the negative world. The Pentax camera and the Genesis Mini 2 are literally in the same spot, just to the right of center below both TVs on different floors. That has to mean something, right? Both are objects of power on the same wavelength, and they just happen to be in the same place at different locations. Am I about to go buy color film and figure out how to get that developed in 2023? Can I will myself to find a micro USB cord to power that Genesis Mini 2? Do I want to visit the negative world to see what it looks like in 2023? Sure, I could easily play older games on a PC emulator or invert any image through Photoshop, but all that involves is pushing buttons on a computer. It's not doing shit. It's not visiting another world. It's faking everything. I would be pretending to have those experiences. Like trying to live a memory of a memory or restarting a dream. It's not really doing something, goddammit. To revisit the negative world to do it correctly would require real action. I need to power slam that cartridge into my 32X and experience the version of Space Harrier that I best remember. I need to spend $13 on a roll of 35mm film and then pay someone at CVS an additional $12 to create those photos. And give me my photo negatives so I can, once again, return to negative worlds I haven't yet seen.